Okay, let's talk a little bit about Phil Schneider. So get in here. This is Jack with Cosmic Road. I talk about UFOs and the paranormal. Please hit like and subscribe and let me know what you think in the comments below. Yeah, Phil Schneider is a very interesting and controversial figure in ufology. So let's do a little exploration of his claims. If you're not real familiar with Phil Schneider, here's the short version. Phil Schneider, and this is the his version. Phil Schneider was a government geologist and later whistleblower who claimed to have worked on multiple U.S. Black Ops military bases, including the now infamous underground base in Dulce, New Mexico. Schneider was allegedly working for the U.S. government building DUMBs, deep underground military bases, and had a level 3 security clearance for several underground facilities. According to Schneider, he was one of 3 survivors in a battle with tall gray aliens that took place in August of 1979 in Dulce, New Mexico, after accidentally drilling into what Phil claims was a pre-existing ET installation. A firefight ensued between the Dulce, I can never say that word right, Dulce military personnel and the gray aliens, and Phil Schneider was shot with what he describes as a beam of energy which burned off 2 of Schneider's fingers completely and ripped open his chest. Sadly, Phil Schneider was found dead January 17, 1996, under suspicious circumstances. His death was ruled a suicide, as his autopsy claimed he was killed by strangulation from his own catheter tubing. And so we'll get into whether or not his claims are valid and whether he was killed suspiciously. So in the pro column, in the pro Phil Schneider column, is this post by Science Boy Jack. Let's start delving into all the obscure, strange aspects of knowledge that Phil Schneider was elaborating to us before he died. How did Phil Schneider know about ultra-efficient mining methods to create deep underground military bases? How would he know about nuclear subterranes and deflagration, vitrification of the rock? Phil Schneider said that this boring machine would vitrify/melt the rock out, different from the method of conventional boring machines, leaving a glassy obsidian-like finish on the wall of the tunnel. How do you think he knew this? He's describing advanced scientific knowledge. Another question, how did Phil lose his fingers and receive serious internal injury to his chest, ribs, lungs? Phil claims he was hit by some kind of alien weapon/mining device from the chest of one of these gray alien beings. He said was a bluish beam that split him open like a fish, and it completely fired him, cauterizing his lungs and ribs, almost killing him, gave him bone cancer. Lastly, how did Phil Schneider know about the terrible smell that these gray alien creatures are associated with? He said the beings smelt like the worst garbage you could imagine. Very strange, obscure details that just happens to coincide with ancient African wisdom on these non-human intelligent creatures. And yeah, you do get that in the lore, not infrequently. The weird bad smell associated with some of these beings. These are questions that should have been answered a long time ago. Only a very few people are smart enough to see past a cover story. This video is a quick way to answer, so it gets into Phil's video, and you can peruse this thread at your leisure. A really good post by Science Boy Jack. But let's get into the debunking camp. Another fraud, Philip Schneider. Nario Hawakawa has already done a deep dive on this guy's personal life, and it sure looks like he was a fraud. However, many won't believe it, so let's go further and show he was really a fraud. Around 2018, Joe from Carolina and his research team issued a FOIA request about Phil Schneider to the FBI. On March 22, 1975, an acquaintance of Phil turned him into the FBI in Oregon. Phil claimed to have been attempting to build a nuclear device and had radioactive materials. the first page of the FOIA release document from the video, and you can see the FOIA. The FBI document states that Phil was at the Damash State Hospital in Oregon between 68 and 69 being treated for schizophrenia. Under stress, he would mutilate himself, and he also amputated his 2 fingers and a thumb. Now, that's the third version of the story that I've heard, how he lost his digits. Obviously there's Phil's version, which was, the aliens lasered it off. And then there's this story where he mutilated himself. I've also heard another story that he lost it due to some explosives. So very interesting, very interesting. Phil removed 300 pounds of this radioactive material and kept it under his bed. The FBI detected radioactivity outside where he lived in the parking lot. This guy was definitely not playing with a full deck. Phil would show various super heavy materials to people that attended his lectures in the 90s. If you received any of these materials from him, you should definitely be aware they could have been dangerously radioactive. Very interesting. I looked into Phil's family tree, and there's no way Phil was telling the truth about his father here, where he says, my father, Otto, fought on both sides of the war. He was originally a U-boat captain and was captured and repatriated in the U.S. But from this article, here's Phil's basic vitals, and disputing that this could have ever happened. Now here's his father, Captain Otto Oscar Schneider. His father, Oscar Schneider, was a captain in the U.S. Navy during World War II. All right, let's go back over here. Public records show that Phil's grandfather moved to the U.S. probably from Germany around 1907, obviously long before World War II. Public marriage records show that Phil's father was married to his mother, Sarah D. Sally Watson, in 39. A bunch of Phil's uncles were born in Portland in 42, or beginning in 1907, and his sister Polly in 42. If Phil would shamelessly lie about his own father in this way, spinning a yarn about him being a Nazi U-boat captain, what else would he lie about? Importantly, notice the FBI document mentions an uncle, Leo Schneider, MD, a physician and surgeon in Portland. An uncle with this name did exist, according to public records. Here he claimed that 2 years after the 1979 Dulce incident, he went to work for several companies. After 2 years recuperating after the 1979 incident, I went back to work for Morrison & Knudsen, EG&G, and other companies, Phil says. This is a lie because his Social Security disability payments began on August 1981, or about 2 years later. He was disabled because he self-mutilated himself, was mentally ill, and slept on hundreds of pounds of radioactive materials beneath his bed. And who knows what else he did. He claimed he was a U.S. government geologist and engineer. Would a trained geologist or engineer sleep on top of radioactive materials in his apartment? Of course not. There's no way he would have been qualified for a security clearance to work for EG&G, who managed Area 51 for a time, or be involved in some super secret tunneling project because he was clearly psychologically unfit. Any background check would surely have found these FBI records. So there you go. So there is a good debunking on Phil Schneider. And that, of course, was brought to us by Richard Geltreich. So what is the debunk to the debunk, you might ask? Well, let's go to a letter written by Phil Schneider's ex-wife. And it's a long letter. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but let's get into the death of Phil Schneider. She says, I have written many articles about how Philip died and why I believe it was a murder and not a suicide. Like Ron was a friend of Phil who died suspiciously. Philip was about to write a book about his knowledge with the help of a friend who lived in Seattle, Washington. In fact, he had just gotten back from his visit when he died in his apartment in Wilson, Wilsonville, Oregon. He died in 96, or he died in January 10th, but his body was not found until January 17th. His body was green and swollen. The first responders, which were his friend and the landlord, believed he had died of a stroke. The sheriff released the body without the Clackamas County coroner looking at his body, which was against the law. It wasn't until I questioned the funeral director that he took a look at the body. It was then discovered that he had a surgical tube wrapped around his throat 3 times and tied in the front. In order for this to happen as a suicide, he would have had to wrap the hose around with his missing fingers and extensive pain in his shoulders, and then knot it. He then sat on the edge of his bed and suffocated, falling into his wheelchair. He did not hang himself with the hose. He just sat there. This is not a normal type of death. In one of his lectures, he stated that if you hear he has committed suicide, you will know that he was murdered. So basically he didn't have the fingers necessary to accomplish this death on his own, from what it appears like. So I think that he was probably murdered. Now, if he did have tendencies towards self-mutilation, you could say maybe he also had tendencies towards suicide. Maybe he could have done this on his own, but I tend to think not. His wife goes on, I asked the medical examiner to hold blood samples and urine samples for later testing. They refused to test them for a person who died of a suicide. I was told that they would be held for 1 year. 10 months later, when I had located a facility that was willing to get involved in the test, the samples had disappeared. Why did I think that his hands had initially been tied? Because his hands at the wrist were at an odd angle where he laid. If you would raise his arms to his back, he was lying on his front, the wrist would be at the correct angle to being tied. His ex-wife goes on to say, it is important to note that many items were missing from his apartment. All of the notes and photographs from his lecture, all of his high math and Masonic books, all of the alien specimens, all of his notes for his book, a box of mineral specimens, and his wallet was missing. The police were at first interested in the wallet, but then it showed up the next day. Many valuable items were all there, jewelry in the nightstand, gold coins in the closet, money in his wallet. The interesting items, not necessarily the valuable items, were taken from his residence. So what about Dulcie? She says, I have to admit I have no definitive proof that this particular event occurred. I know that Morrison Knudsen was a contractor for underground mountain bases, and I can prove that Philip did work for them. So many other things he talked about were true and accurate, so why not that? He would talk about the machines that would bore holes and create a surface automatically of the fast-moving monorail underground. When asked if he ever rode one, he said no. Now, if he was lying, why would he say he never rode one? A liar would probably enjoy giving details of a ride from one coast to another in a fast-moving mode of transport. When I first met Philip, I noticed there was an unusual truck with a wood canopy. It had a Canada license plate. Everywhere we went, I would see this truck. Someone wanted us to know we were being followed. My phone would click when I talked on it, and he eventually went to the FBI. The clicks stopped. She also talks about some more suspicious stuff that happened, and she also gives a little clarity on why obtaining his records may be problematic. Apparently, he worked under the wrong social security number for most of his work life, and it was only discovered when he applied for SSA. I found paperwork in his apartment after his death that proves most of his work record was under the wrong number. But because the number was being used by a living person, there was little I could do after his death. As for some of the other stuff, she says that Phil would sometimes talk to people and get their stories, and these people did not want to come out. They didn't want to come out of the closet. They didn't want to go public. And so Phil would incorporate their stories into his own story as if he were the person living those experiences and not them. So an interesting possibility that may explain some of the confusion. So what are we to make of all of this? The debunks on Phil Schneider are pretty good. But the debunks of the debunks are pretty good too. He does seem to have been a troubled individual, paranoid. He may have been inclined to self-mutilation. His ex-wife says that he had a gunshot wound and many shrapnel wounds on his body, in addition to having MS. She doesn't talk about the laser wound that opened him up like a fish, or talk about, the possibility that his fingers may have been lasered off by an alien. I tend to think that part of the story is probably not true. Maybe, somebody else had some sort of conflict with aliens and he incorporated that into his own story, but he really lost his hands or his fingers in a different way. But, it's hard to know the truth of all of this. He is definitely a problematic character in that he does seem to have had real mental issues and struggles in his life. But at the same time, I don't think he killed himself. So some of what he is saying is probably on point. And then there's the things that he got right. The detailed description of this boring technology, for example. Oh, and here's some interesting observations from G. Clinton, his one-time roommate. About his missing fingers, here we get a fourth version of the story. He told me he had lost them when he was working in Eastern Oregon as a lineman when he had some sort of mishap on a pole. About his chest wound. I took him to the hospital. One day I was talking to other roomers in the common room. Phil came down the stairs with blood on his shirt saying he'd been shot. A story he quickly changed to somehow being inflicted by a passing car losing a snow stud, which struck him in the chest, causing the wounds. No one present believed him, of course, but it was certainly not the time for discussions of his credibility. I took him to the hospital. At this point, and having my own suspicions, I said to the doctor, "You suspect it's self-inflicted?" The doctor said yes. And here's another interesting bit provided by Chris White, again talking about the FOIA document. There are newly released docs that show how Phil lost his fingers. He cut them off himself while in a mental health facility. So yeah, my heart goes out to Phil. He definitely had some struggles. He was going through some mental torture, it sounds like. Torturing himself, possibly mutilating his own body. But is his story true? Is any part of his story true? I mean, as his wife said, as I've already read, I know that Morrison Knudsen was a contractor for underground mountain bases, and I can prove that Philip did work for them. And he knew about the boring technology, etc. So could he have been a delusional, paranoid person that had tendencies towards self-mutilation that did happen to come across some real information? And then as he started talking about this, people would come up to him telling him their own stories that he would then incorporate into his own. That is kind of where I lean. That's what makes sense to me. But let me know what you guys think in the comments below. And if you've enjoyed this video, please give me a big thumbs up. I sure would appreciate it. Smash the like button and the subscribe button and the bell to be notified of future videos. You don't want to miss a thing. Join me on social media, Facebook and Twitter, links below. Love to see you guys there. If you wanted to support Cosmic Road in an even bigger way, consider grabbing a coffee mug or a t-shirt in the merch store below, or by becoming a channel member, because channel members are rock stars, and I really appreciate you guys' support. Thank you so much. Meanwhile, there are plenty of other videos on the channel, and I'll see you guys next time. This is Jack with Cosmic Road, signing out.